That night, long before dawn even thought about touching the horizon, the valley lay silent under a sky that felt too wide for the people trying to survive beneath it. The earth had cracked open in long, jagged lines that ran across the land like the scars of some old forgotten war. It had been months since a drop of rain touched Galilee. The farmers no longer bothered counting the days. They had stopped speaking about the weather too. At some point, when you are surrounded by the same unchanging misery, the words just stop meaning anything. The wind was a dry kind of wind, the sort that whispered across abandoned fields and climbed over splintered fences with the slow patience of time itself. It carried dust that stung the eyes and settled on everything that once held color. Even the hills looked tired, as if they had bent their backs under the sun for too long. The people of the valley were not strangers to hardship. They were men and women who had endured long seasons, lean harvests, and quiet losses, but this drought was different. It pressed down on them with a weight that felt personal. It felt as if the land itself had decided to let go. Livestock grew thin, wells sank deeper into silence, children asked fewer questions, and the old men sat outside their porches staring at the horizon, as if waiting for a sign they no longer believed would come. It was in those days, when the ground seemed ready to crumble and the spirits of the people were not far behind, that a rumor drifted into the valley from the dusty road that cut through the hills. Two travelers had passed by a small market on the southern edge, and as they filled their flasks at the last working water barrel, one of them mentioned a name that carried a quiet kind of power. Jesus. The name moved through the valley like a small breeze, soft, uncertain, but just loud enough that people turned their heads. Some had heard stories. A man who touched the sick and they rose. A man who spoke gently and yet his words settled into the heart like stone. A man who walked from town to town, leaving behind something people thought they had lost forever. Hope. No one in the valley dared to say the word out loud. It felt too fragile, like it might break if spoken. But they felt it all the same, stirring somewhere beneath the layers of weariness and dust. The next morning, before the sky had fully traded its gray for gold, something shifted. A few farmers gathering at the empty well noticed a shape far down the road. A lone figure, walking steadily toward them. His pace was neither rushed nor wandering. It was the pace of a man who walked with purpose, a man who understood the weight of every step he took. The farmers stood. Some shaded their eyes, others squinted into the haze. "Who is that?" someone asked. No one answered, because deep inside, they already knew. The man drew closer, and with each step, the air around the valley seemed to change. Maybe it was only imagination, or maybe it was something else. But for the first time in many long weeks, people stepped out of their homes not because they had to, but because they felt pulled by something they could not explain. Jesus stopped at the center of the valley, near the old communal well that had run dry months ago. He looked down into its darkness. There was nothing to be heard except the hollow echo of emptiness. But he did not turn away. Behind him, the villagers gathered, hesitant, thirsty in more ways than one. The oldest among them, Joah, stepped forward. He had lived through storms that tore down houses and winters that claimed friends. But he had never seen the land suffer like this. His voice shook, not out of weakness, but out of the weight of truth. "Master," he said quietly, "we have prayed, we have waited, we have done all we know how to do. But the land is dying beneath us. Our animals cannot endure much longer. If tomorrow comes without water, we fear we will not stand." Jesus lifted his eyes from the well and looked at the faces before him. He saw lines carved by years of labor. Shoulders burdened with more than just the drought, eyes dimmed by long nights spent hoping for a dawn that never seemed to come. "When people look only at what they have lost," he said, "they forget what still lives within them. You do not only need water, you need faith." His voice was low, steady, carrying the kind of calm that made the crowd fall silent. It was not the kind of faith spoken in temples or preached in crowded squares. It was something older, deeper, woven into the fiber of life itself. But faith was hard to remember in days like these. Jesus looked out across the silent field, once the pride of the valley. Now it was nothing more than a cracked plain stretching endlessly under the sun. "Take me," he said, "to the driest ground you have." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. But they obeyed. They led him along a narrow path, through patches of dead grass and past the brittle remains of last season's crops, until they reached the heart of the valley. It was a desolate sight. The earth had split into plates that overlapped like the scales of some ancient creature. Dust settled into every crack. The air shimmered with heat though the morning was still young. "Here," Joah said quietly, "this is where our best harvest once came from. Now it does not even hold the memory of rain." Jesus walked to the center. He knelt down, letting the dust rise around him in a soft cloud. Then he placed his palm flat against the dry, broken earth. The crowd held its breath. There were no signs, no whispers from the sky, no sudden winds, no divine tremors, only a man kneeling in silence, listening to the land as though it spoke a language only he understood. The villagers watched him, unsure whether to hope or to protect themselves from the disappointment that so often followed hope. After a long quiet, Jesus opened his eyes. "This land," he said, "is not dead, it is waiting to be awakened." And though his words were simple, something in them pushed back against the heaviness that had been pressing on the valley for months. He stood, brushed the dust from his hands, and turned to the villagers. "Bring me every container of water you still have, even one last drop." They hesitated. Water was life, water was survival, and they had so little left. But something in his voice steadied them. One by one, they left to gather whatever they could. Jars with a thin film at the bottom. Bowls with a swallow of water. Cups that held barely more than a sip. When they returned, Jesus looked at the small collection, and there was no judgment in his eyes. "Pour them together," he said. They did. The water came together in a shallow basin, the surface barely covering the bottom, a painful reminder of how little remained. A man choked back tears. "Master, what can such a small amount do?" Jesus stepped forward, dipped his hand into the basin, and stirred gently. "Even the smallest drop," he said, "carries the life God placed within it from the beginning." The villagers leaned in, breathless, and something began to stir beneath the water. It began as a soft motion, a small swirl that grew and brightened, as if remembering what it was meant to be. The villagers stared at the basin, unable to look away. The water moved with a life that did not come from the wind or from Jesus' hand. It swirled slowly, gathering itself like a memory rising from the deep. The faint ripple grew brighter, clearer, until the surface seemed to glow with its own quiet strength. Someone whispered, "Is it changing?" No one answered. They were afraid that speaking might break the fragile miracle taking shape before them. Jesus watched the water with calm eyes, as if this was not a surprise to him, as if he had been waiting for this very moment since before he arrived in the valley. His hand continued to move in a slow circle, guiding nothing, forcing nothing, simply inviting the water to remember what it was made for. With each passing heartbeat, the water began to rise. A soft gasp rolled through the crowd as they stepped back, not in fear, but in awe. The shallow basin brimmed with water, then spilled over. Thin streams ran down the sides, dripping onto the parched ground. The dust drank the first drops greedily, darkening as if recognizing an old friend. And then the water kept flowing. It rose softly, like a wellspring breathing beneath the surface. It wasn't violent or loud. It didn't roar like a river breaking free. It rose the way morning light rises over a sleeping world, gentle but unstoppable. Jesus lifted his hand from the basin, but the water continued to move on its own. He stepped aside and let it spill freely onto the earth. The villagers watched it spread across the cracked soil. It seeped into the deep lines that had formed over months of drought. The land began to soften, its dry rigidity trembling as if waking from a long and difficult sleep. Joah, the old man, fell to his knees. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I have never, in all my years, seen the earth drink this way." Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "God remembers the places we forget," he said. "Even the broken ground has a pulse." And the land answered. The cracks pulled together, closing slowly like wounds finally healing. The dry plates of earth shifted, settling back into the shape they had once known. A soft hum filled the air, though no one could say where it came from. Maybe the wind, maybe the soil, maybe something deeper. Across the valley floor, the first scent of moisture rose, raw and rich. It was the smell of soil waking, the kind that carried memories of harvests long past. A woman covered her mouth with both hands as tears filled her eyes. "The earth is breathing," she whispered. Jesus nodded gently. "It has been waiting to breathe." The water continued to spread until the entire field glistened under a thin sheen. The sun caught the surface, scattering light across the valley like tiny sparks. And then, near the far edge of the field, something stirred. A small green shoot pushed through the soil. It was no bigger than a fingernail, a fragile thing in a world that had forgotten color. Yet it stood there trembling in the morning light, alive and unafraid. A young boy stepped forward, eyes wide. He pointed with a trembling hand. "Look, something is growing." The villagers turned, and for the first time in months, they ran, not out of fear, but out of a desperate longing to be close to life again. They gathered around the small shoot. Some knelt, some reached out with shaking hands but stopped themselves from touching it, as if it were too sacred. Then another shoot broke through the soil. And another. And another. Tiny green blades rose across the field, turning the once dead land into a patchwork of new life. It was slow at first, but then it spread like a tide sweeping in from a distant shore. The valley erupted with soft cries, gasps, and whispers. People held each other. Some laughed, though their laughter sounded like tears. Others trembled, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding beneath their feet. Jesus watched quietly, hands folded, the faintest trace of a smile in his eyes. Not pride, not triumph, just a deep and gentle knowing. "Hope does not vanish," he said softly. "It only waits for someone to remember it." Joe arose unsteadily to his feet, his voice trembling as he asked, "Master, how is this possible?" Jesus looked out over the field, now breathing with new color. "Faith," he answered. "Faith is not only for the heart. It is for the land, for the work of your hands, for the days when you think nothing good remains. Faith is the voice that whispers to the barren places and says, 'Live again.'" The wind carried his words across the awakening field. The shoots continued to rise, stretching higher, reaching for the warmth of the sun. The earth beneath them grew soft and rich. Birds that had long abandoned the valley circled overhead, sensing life returning. Children ran through the field, their feet splashing in the shallow pools left by the overflowing basin. They laughed with a kind of wild joy that had been buried inside them for too long. For a moment, it felt like the valley had stepped back into a forgotten time. A time when abundance felt natural and days were not measured by loss. Jesus stepped away from the basin and walked along the edge of the field. Wherever his shadow touched the soil, the ground seemed to hum a little deeper. A young woman followed him, hesitating before she spoke. "Master, will this last? Is the land truly healed?" Jesus paused, turning to her with gentle eyes. "The miracle begins with the water," he said, "but it lives because of what is in your hearts. If you tend this land with the same hope you felt today, it will thrive. If you trust, even when the sky is silent, it will flourish." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. She nodded, holding them close. The villagers moved around Jesus, not crowding him, but drawn to him by something quiet and true. They wanted to say thank you, but thank you felt too small. They wanted to offer something, but what could they give a man who restored life with nothing more than a touch? A prayer, and faith that never wavered? Jesus looked around at the revived field, then back at the people who had waited so long for a sign. His voice dropped to a soft whisper. "Remember this day, not because of what you have seen, but because of what it has awakened within you. God does not forget those who hope. Even when the land cracks, the heart is still capable of blooming." He turned toward the road that led out of the valley, the same road he had walked that morning. The villagers watched as he began to move, slow and steady, his footsteps quiet on the dampened soil. Someone called out behind him, "Will you return, Master?" Jesus paused, but did not turn. "Where there is faith," he said, "I am never far." And then he walked on, the rising sun casting a long, warm line behind him. The valley stood in silence. But it was not the silence of drought, or fear, or despair. It was the silence of a land breathing again. A silence filled with promise. A silence ready for harvest. The sun dragged itself across the sky like an old worn lantern losing its flame. By late afternoon, the air had turned heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Mary and Joseph stayed close to Jesus as he walked the dry perimeter of the settlement. Every footstep sent tiny clouds of dust floating upward, soft and slow, like ghosts rising to listen to whatever he might say next. Jesus paused near a field where the soil had cracked into long tired lines that looked like the wrinkles of an aging world. He crouched down, brushing the dry grains of earth with his fingers. His eyes softened, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the stillness of a man who understood more than any of them could name. "This land remembers," he murmured. "It remembers every seed planted with hope and every harvest shared with gratitude. The earth is a witness, not an enemy." The farmers gathered behind him in a semicircle, their faces lit by a mix of fear and longing. Paul, the eldest of the group, stepped forward. His boots were worn to the point of bending in the wrong places. And his voice cracked when he spoke. "Sir, we are ashamed," he said quietly. "Some of us turned against each other when the wells dried. We doubted, we blamed, we let fear make us into people we never wanted to be." Jesus rose slowly, brushing dust from his hands. He looked at Paul the way a father looks at a son who's finally told the truth. "Fear tries to rewrite a man's heart," Jesus said, "but the heart can still choose what story it wants to tell." For a moment, silence draped itself over the gathering. Even the wind stalled, no birds called, no branches creaked. It was as if the world were leaning closer, waiting for the next breath. Jesus turned to Mary. "Show me the last remaining well." She nodded, though her hands trembled. Joseph steadied her by the elbow, and together they led Jesus through a narrow path winding between thorny bushes and brittle grass. The villagers followed, moving like a slow procession of hope and exhaustion. When they reached the well, the scene was heavier than any of them had prepared for. The stone walls surrounding the well were cracked. The rope for the bucket hung limp, frayed, and brittle. The ground around it was dusted with a fine white silt like old bones crushed beneath sorrow. Paul spoke again with a voice that seemed afraid to echo. "This well dried up 3 weeks ago. Not a drop since." Jesus stepped forward and placed his hand on the worn stone. The villagers held their breath as if any sudden exhale might break whatever fragile moment they were witnessing. Jesus closed his eyes. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of dusty orange and muted gold. As he stood there, the wind finally returned, moving softly, curling around his robe like it recognized him. After a long silence, Jesus opened his eyes. "Water has not abandoned you," he said, "but you have stopped listening to the land." Whispers spread through the group. Someone muttered, "Listening to the land? How do we do that when everything is dying?" Jesus looked at them with a steady calm. And when he spoke, his words rolled through the crowd like deep thunder from faraway mountains. "Nothing truly dies when faith is still alive within you. Drought tests the soil, but it tests the soul even more. You have lived with fear. Now learn to walk with hope." Mary swallowed hard, eyes shining with a mixture of emotion she couldn't name. Joseph placed a hand over his heart as if Jesus's words stirred something buried deep inside him. Paul stepped closer. "What do we do now?" Jesus rested his hand on Paul's shoulder. "You work together. You share what little you have. You lift the weak and steady the broken. You rebuild your faith before you rebuild your fields." The group shifted, exchanging glances that held a fragile spark of renewal. But Jesus wasn't done. "Tonight," he said softly, "we gather, every family, every soul. We come together in the center of the settlement. Bring whatever food remains, no matter how small. Bring water, even if it's only a cup. Bring yourselves with honesty and humility." Mary hesitated. "What will happen tonight?" Jesus's voice deepened, wrapping around them like a slow warm wind drifting across open plains. "The land listens when the people become one. And from unity, blessings return." Paul wiped the corner of his eye, embarrassed but relieved. "We will prepare," he said. "We'll tell every home." The people scattered, moving with a sense of purpose they hadn't felt in months. Mary and Joseph stayed with Jesus as they walked back toward the settlement's heart. Behind them, the sky slowly dimmed into a deep rustic glow, the kind seen only in the most honest parts of the countryside. Mary looked up at Jesus. "Do you think they'll believe again?" Jesus smiled gently, the kind of smile that makes time slow down. Belief grows like the first sprout after rain. Small, fragile, but full of promise. Joseph exhaled the breath he had been holding for too long. "I hope that promise is enough to save us." Jesus looked out across the fading horizon where the land stretched wide and humble. "Hope is never small, Joseph. It is the seed from which every miracle begins." As night approached, lights flickered across the settlement one by one as families prepared for the gathering. The sound of children's steps returned, soft and unsure. Elders lit lamps and whispered prayers they thought they had forgotten. Pots clanged, wood cracked in the fire pits. The village, long muted by despair, hummed again with faint traces of life. Jesus stood at the edge of the scene, watching the people come together. In that moment, even without rain, something had already begun to change. Not in the sky, not in the soil, but in the hearts of those who had nearly given up. And sometimes, Jesus knew, that was where the true drought ended first. Night settled gently over the settlement like a blanket worn smooth by years of use. The moon rose quietly above the hills, casting a pale silver glow across the rooftops and the broken fields. Lanterns flickered in front of every home, their flames trembling against the soft wind. It had been a long time since the village had seen this many lights burning at once. It felt like the land itself was waking up. Families began to gather in the open clearing at the center of the settlement. Mothers carried small clay bowls of grain or roots. Fathers brought jars of water wrapped carefully in cloth, and children walked beside them holding onto their sleeves. Each step felt sacred, as if they were walking towards something ancient, something that had been waiting for them all along. Jesus stood quietly near the old oak tree at the edge of the clearing. The tree's branches stretched wide above him, the leaves whispering softly as though greeting an old friend. Jesus closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the night air, letting its coolness settle into his chest. Mary approached with a blanket draped over her arm. "People are nervous," she whispered. "They've forgotten what it feels like to hope." Jesus opened his eyes and gave her a gentle nod. "Tonight, they will remember." Joseph walked over, carrying a small lantern. He set it down at Jesus's feet, and the light brushed across the ground in warm uneven circles. "Everyone is here," he said, "or at least, everyone who still believes something can change." Jesus stepped forward toward the gathering. The crowd parted slightly as he entered the center, but not out of fear, out of reverence, out of a quiet understanding that something deep was about to unfold. Paul, the old farmer, stood nearest to Jesus, holding a wooden bowl with a single handful of grain. He bowed his head slightly. "It's not much, but it's all that's left from my home." Jesus placed his hand over Paul's. A gift is never measured by its size, only by the heart that offers it. The villagers exhaled slowly, like they had been holding their breath for days. One by one, families stepped forward, placing their small offerings of food and water at Jesus's feet. A handful of beans, a crust of bread, a small cup of water. Pieces so small they hardly seemed worth calling food, but together they formed a fragile circle of hope. Jesus knelt beside the offerings, his fingers tracing the dirt as if speaking to the earth itself. Children leaned forward, wide-eyed, sensing something they couldn't name. Elders wiped at their eyes, not from sadness but from the strange feeling of light returning to places inside them that had long been dark. Jesus looked up at the crowd. His voice, when it rose, was slow and deep, like the low hum of a storm rolling across a distant plain. "Tonight, we stand as one, every home, every heart, gathered under the same sky. The land has been thirsty, but so have our spirits. Fear has divided you, but here, in this circle, you have come together." A woman in the back wiped her cheeks with her sleeve. A man whispered a prayer he thought he had forgotten. The air thickened with emotion. heavy but warm, like the first breath after a long cry. Jesus placed both hands gently on the gathered food. Blessing does not come from abundance, he said softly. It comes from unity, from trust, from the simple act of believing that what you share multiplies. He closed his eyes, and the wind shifted, sweeping gently across the clearing. The lantern flames flickered, bending toward him. The oak tree rustled as if leaning closer. Even the ground seemed to quiet itself. May this food nourish more than the body, Jesus whispered. May it heal the broken places inside you. May the land hear your unity. May hope return like the first drop of water after drought. When he finished, the wind stopped, lantern flames steadied, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then Paul stared at the bowls in disbelief. The grain, he whispered. It looks fuller. Mary choked on a small gasp. The jars, they're not empty anymore. The water, it's higher. Joseph bent down, examining the offerings with wide, trembling eyes. This is not possible. Jesus stood, his expression calm, the faintest smile on his lips. When hearts open, he said, miracles find room to grow. Word rippled through the crowd like a wave. People pressed closer, tears forming, hands shaking. Mothers lifted their children so they could see. Fathers held their breath as if afraid any sound might break the moment. But Jesus wasn't finished. He raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the northern ridge where the sky stretched dark and empty. Lift your eyes, he said. There is something the land wants to show you. The villagers turned, though many were afraid to hope. The sky was quiet, still, unchanging. Then, almost too faint to notice, a soft gray shape began to form in the distance. A thin thread of movement. A whisper of shifting air. Mary grabbed Joseph's arm. Is that smoke? Jesus shook his head softly. Not smoke. The shape thickened, rolling gently across the horizon like a slow-moving veil. Paul stepped forward, his voice trembling. That's a cloud. Jesus nodded. Yes, the first one. Villagers gasped, covered their mouths, clutched one another's hands. Some fell to their knees. Children pointed at the sky with wide, sparkling eyes. It's been months since we've seen a single one, Joseph whispered. Jesus spoke again, his voice like calm thunder echoing inside every heart. The land has heard your unity. Blessings return to the places where fear once lived. As they stared, the cloud grew darker at its center, edges curling with slow gentle promise. The smell of distant moisture drifted on the wind, faint, fragile, but unmistakable. A promise of rain. The villagers stood frozen, staring at the sky as though witnessing the beginning of a long-awaited miracle. Tears streamed down faces hardened by months of struggle. Paul let out a broken laugh, the kind that comes from a man who suddenly remembers what hope feels like. Mary whispered, Jesus, is this real? Jesus looked at her, his voice soft but certain. Yes, Mary, and it is only the beginning. Behind him, the cloud thickened again, rolling closer to the village with slow, steady confidence, like a blessing walking home. The first cloud drifted above the settlement like a slow-moving ship. Heavy with promise, the villagers watched it in absolute stillness, as if a single breath, too sharp or too loud, might scare it away. Mothers held their children close. Fathers reached for their hats but forgot to put them on. Old men who had not stood fully upright in years found themselves rising, their backs straightening without effort, pulled upward by the feeling that something ancient and kind had returned to them. Jesus stepped toward the center of the clearing. Paul, Mary, Joseph, and the rest of the villagers circled around him, their faces glowing in the soft lantern light. The air had changed. It carried a coolness now, faint but unmistakable, as though the sky had dipped low enough for everyone to touch it. Jesus lifted his gaze toward the cloud. The land answers the heart that listens. He said softly, when the people become one, the land remembers how to give. A low rumble echoed in the distance, gentle, hesitant, like thunder clearing its throat. A few villagers stumbled backward in shock. Mary covered her mouth. I haven't heard thunder in months. Jesus nodded slowly. Thunder speaks when rain prepares to walk. The cloud thickened, folding into itself like a great dark blanket stretching across the sky. Stars disappeared behind it, the moon dimmed, the wind gathered, curling through the settlement with a sound like whispered prayers being returned to their senders. Joseph clutched Mary's hand. Jesus, will it come tonight? Jesus's eyes softened. Yes, Joseph, the blessing is already on its way. And then it happened. A single drop. So small, it could have been mistaken for a falling seed. It drifted from the cloud, spinning gently through the air until it landed on Paul's withered sleeve. Paul froze, staring at the tiny dark circle spreading across the dry fabric. Mary, he whispered, voice cracking, it touched me. Another drop fell, and then another. Slow at first, like the sky was learning how to rain again after too long a silence. Drops tapped against rooftops, slipped down the sides of empty wells, dotted the ground like new footprints from heaven itself. Children laughed through tears, mothers cried openly, fathers tilted their heads back, letting water strike their foreheads, their cheeks, their open mouths. Paul raised both arms to the sky. Thank you, he whispered, then louder, thank you. But the sky wasn't finished. A sudden gust swept across the village, carrying with it a deeper rumble, a richer growl from the belly of the clouds above. Then the rain came harder, steady and bold, falling in sheets that soaked the earth within seconds. Water poured into cracks in the soil, flooding the places where dryness had carved its sorrow. It trickled down rooftops and splashed against the wooden posts of barns. It darkened the dust under people's feet until the ground softened, drinking greedily from the sky as though waking from a long, painful sleep. Mary threw her arms around Joseph. He lifted her off the ground, laughing like a man who had rediscovered the world. Children ran barefoot, kicking up mud with their heels. Neighbors who had not spoken in months embraced without shame. The rain washed everything, the fear, the bitterness, the quiet resentment that drought had planted in their hearts. Jesus stood among them, rain falling over his shoulders, his hair, his hands, but he did not wipe it away. He let it fall freely, like the sky itself recognized him and wanted to bless him first. Paul approached, tears mixing with the rain on his face. Jesus, how do we ever repay you? Jesus looked at him with a glow that felt more like warmth than light. You don't repay a blessing, he said gently. You live it, you share it, you let it shape the way you treat one another. Mary stepped closer. Will you stay with us? Even just for a while? Jesus smiled, the kind of smile that feels like a final note of a familiar hymn drifting through a quiet church. Mary, the Father calls me to many places. There are other hearts waiting, other lands listening for hope. Her eyes softened with sadness, though she nodded in understanding. Jesus walked toward the old well. Rainwater spilled over its rim now, dripping steadily back into the earth. He placed his hand upon the stone. From this well, he said, life will return, your fields will grow again. But remember this, the true drought was never in the land. It was in your unity. And tonight, that drought ended. Paul bowed his head. We won't forget. Jesus stepped back from the well. The villagers gathered around him, silent, reverent, as though the rain itself had become a choir singing in the background. Then, quietly, Jesus began to walk toward the edge of the village, the rain parting gently as he moved. Mary, Joseph, and Paul followed a few steps behind before stopping, knowing deep in their bones that this was where the moment ended. Jesus turned one last time. The rain framed him in soft silver lines, the lantern lights flickering behind the villagers like a constellation of small earthly stars. Take care of one another, he said, and the land will take care of you. Then he walked into the rain, into the dark, into the quiet open fields beyond the settlement. His figure grew smaller, then blurred, then vanished completely into the curtain of falling water. The villagers stood in silence long after he disappeared. As dawn approached, the rain softened to a gentle mist. The sky brightened, and the land, once cracked and broken, breathed again. The first sprouts appeared 3 days later, tiny, green, determined. And every person in the settlement remembered that night, the night the sky finally returned. The night the rain walked home. The night Jesus taught them that miracles do not fall from above, they rise from the unity of those who are willing to believe again. And from that day on, whenever thunder rolled across those fields, the villagers would look toward the hills and whisper the same words. He kept his promise.